At times the borders of the Ottoman Empire almost reached Vienna in the north, Yemen in the south, Algeria in the west and today's Iran in the east. The Ottoman state was a form of theocracy, based on strict notions of hierarchy and order, with the sultan on the top exercising absolute, divine right at its pinnacle. To what extent the Ottoman elite believed that their sultan was the supreme ruler of the Islamic world, to whom all others were expected to defer, is still in need of further investigation, and here we will not attempt to deal with this matter. But we have to admit that according to Islam, governors and statesmen are simultaneously judges and supervisors. Their power could be executive, administrative and judicial, but cannot be legislative. Legislator, lawmaker, is only Allah, and He has given already His norms and rules for governing through the revelation of Mohammed. According to the Islamic teaching, supreme governor and ruler is Allah Himself, people are His subjects, slaves. Allah is the only monadic source of power. In the Islamic umma, every Muslim is not conditional, but imperatively believer. All that is leading tofusion of religious and civil community and suspension of political freedom of individual on behalf of the state. That is why state in Islam is the only real political subject and not the individual as it is in Christian tradition. Institutionof caliphate represents legitimate Islamic state after the death of her creator. In the same time, despite of its enormous success, Arabic aristocracy could not keep infinite control over the entire umma, because Islam itself undermines such an Arabic superiority. Everyone who adopts Islam become equal despite his ethnic origin or communal position. Islam widely opens gate for all gifted and ambitious non-Arabs. With the adoption of Islam, Syrians, Persians, Turks, etc. are becoming pillars of Islamic civilization. Therefore, despite of the fact that Islam and caliphate political tradition become the base on which Ottoman Empire built its society, it rests on balance and synthesis, a new society neither pure Muslim, nor Christian, for which the exact word is Ottoman. For almost 600 years within the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire, three main religious groups, Christians, Jews and Muslims, used to live together. No one of these religious groups were ethnically pure. They were divided even among themselves into a variety of religious shades. The Ottoman system first divided all these people into the domain of faithful, the Muslims, and the domain of war, the non-Muslims. In Islamic religious law, Sharia, and quite often in Ottoman official writings, it was customary to describe the world as being made up of the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, and the Dar al-Harb, the House of War. It is interesting that to the first category belonged not only the domains of the Ottoman sultans themselves, but also those of other Sunni Muslims, such as the Uzbek Khans or the Mughals of India. In the same time, again in conformity with religious law, non-Muslim rulers who had accepted to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan were considered part of the Islamic world. One such polity was Dubrovnik, a city-state that due to its size and location was able to avoid most of the conflicts in which the empire was involved. Other dependencies of the empire governed by non-Muslim rulers, and by virtue of this relationship part of the Islamic world, that one might mention were the principalities of Moldavia, Transylvania, Wallachia, etc. The rights and obligations of each individual in the Ottoman Empire were determined by the position they had in one of these two groups, the group, House, of Islam and group, House, of War. The Turks were by no means in the situation of a dominating majority opposed to oppressed minorities everywhere in the empire. In many regions they themselves were in the position of minorities, at least in respect of their numbers. The non-Muslims community was divided into millets, administrative units organized on the basis of religious affiliation rather than ethnic origin. The principal duties of the subjects organized in their millets were to pay their taxes, to keep the order and to observe their respective religious and cultural freedom, under their own religious and lay leaders. The term millet originally meant religion and religious community. In the end of the 17th century, while still keeping its original meaning, it also began to denote such modern concepts as nation and nationality. The Quran and Islam recognized Jews and Christians as people of the book who worshipped the same God as Muslims. Islam penalized only partially Jews and Christians for failing to accept God's most recent revelation through the Prophet Mohammed. Prophet Mohammed himself was the one who established a binding precedent for his successors when dealing with non-Muslims through his agreement with the Jewish tribes of Medina. During the time of the Muslim conquest, non-Muslim people of the book who inhabit a town or community, hostile to Muslims, had to choose among three alternatives: to accept Islam, to accept a dhimmi status of dependent tax payers, or to resist till the end and be destroyed or deprived of their rights and treated as pagans. Following the pattern of Muhammad, later Muslim authorities will continue to recognize the rights of believers in the monotheistic religions to remain at peace within the Muslim state, as long as they recognized Islam's political authority and paid their taxes. Normally the relations between Muslims and non-Muslims and between the Muslim state and non-Muslim subjects were based and regulated on the principles of the Islamic law and tradition. Speaking in general, the concepts of the other has long roots in history. The ancient Greeks divided the world into that of civilized Greeks and of barbarian others. Barbarians could be brave, courageous and even gentile, but they did not possess civilization. For Jews, there are the Goyim, rest of the world, the non-Jews, the other whose lack of certain characteristics keeps them outside the chosen Jewish community. The same was for Muslims, for whom the notion of the dhimmi became another way of talking about difference. In our case, Muslims regard Christians and Jews as the people of the book or dhimmi, who received God's revelation before Muhammad and therefore obtained particular, but incomplete message. Thus, dhimmi have religion, civilization, and message of God, but since they received only part of that message, they are inherently different from and inferior to Muslims. So the Millet system was not an original Ottoman innovation and had its origins in the earlier states, both Muslim, Umayyad and Abbasid, and non-Muslim, Persian and Byzantine. That is why speaking about Millet system, Ottoman general contribution to it was mainly to regulate and institutionalize it. The system helped to be created a tolerable minority status for different religious groups. However, it also placed rigid restrictions on individual freedoms within each millet. This system not only allowed the state to control communities through religious institutions but also allowed religious hierarchies to control internal dissent and combat heterodoxy. Sometimes, when the situation required, the Ottomans were going beyond the protection stipulated by the Islamic law and practice. For example, from the very beginning the Ottoman Empire adopted the policy of recognition of the Orthodox Church as part of the Ottoman state. The leaders of the Church, the Patriarch, the Metropolitans, the bishops were partly included into the Ottoman ruling class. One of the most noteworthy attributes of Ottoman rule was its toleration of the different religious beliefs, organized into millets. At that time, Ottoman toleration through the millet system was really unique and just. The Turkish conquerors tolerated the other two religions, at a time when toleration was very rare in Europe. Let us just remember what the Christian Catholic Crusaders did when they sacked Byzantium at the end of 12th and the beginning of 13th century. The Orthodox Church calendar is full of martyrs, clergy and laymen, victims of the Catholics' cruelty. No wonder that Orthodox world considered Catholic Europe as bad or even worse than the Turks. Ottoman tolerance was based mainly on cleverness and goodwill. To control a vast territory where the population was primarily Christians was the only reasonable way to behave for the Turks, to be tolerant and just. The purpose of the millet system was to keep the subjects of different religions, tradition and languages, as much as possible separated, so to avoid religious conflicts and revolts against the Sultan. Therefore, avoidance of non-Muslims was recommended and encouraged by Muslim religious specialists, while Christian priests and Jewish rabbis made analogous recommendations to their respective congregations. The millets therefore lived in different quarters of the cities and in separated villages out of the country. The only place where members of different millets came normally into contact was in the market area. There were two types of local government of the millets. Ottoman officials and religious judges adjudicated civil and criminal cases involving Muslims and non-Muslim citizens. Priest and Jews or Christian primates collected taxes and effectively governed at the local level. When the two systems operated in coordination, the life of the millet was going smoothly and in peace. When the two systems competed, the result was complexity and abuse. In such an atmosphere of uncertainty, which was emblematic for the last 2 centuries of the Ottoman Empire, people sought security in direct patronage relationships with the individuals in power. With some exceptions, as the case mentioned above, the ruling class intervened in the life of the Millet very seldom and normally when the Millet leaders were unable to assure tax payment or the maintenance of security by their followers. Religious tolerance was for the Ottomans a real sound basis for government. For example, in almost all European Christian states until modern times only one form of religion was accepted, Christianity, and not any form of Christianity but the one officially adopted by the ruling class of the country. Spain persecuted and forced many Muslims, Jews, Gypsies and non-Catholic Christians to migrated. In Catholic France, the state and church persecuted and executed thousands of Albigenses, Cathars, Templars, Huguenots and other Christians because the confession they had was different to the one confessed by the Pope and the King of France. This was obviously not the case and practice in the Ottoman domains. Different Christian denominations and Jewish congregations were allowed to practice freely their religion. Ottoman religious toleration was not perfect. The Ottoman Empire was by all means a Muslim state, that is why the autonomy and pluralism of the Millet system did not diminish the superiority of Muslim religion, and the power of the central authorities. Each Millet had the right to deal with religious matters concerning the church and priesthood, with matters relating to the individual and family such as marriage, divorce, engagements and inheritance. But other matters, notably economic and commercial ones, law and order, and most penalties, were left outside the Millet's prerogatives. The non-Muslim population was imposed with special levies of money and labor, and special restrictions were placed on the personal freedom. In court, the testimony of the Muslim was always more trustworthy than that of the non-Muslim. Marriages between Muslims and non-Muslims were illegal. Only a Muslim man could marry a Christian woman. Most hated of all was the forced conscription of male children for the Ottoman military or civil service. This practice known as devshirme or blood levy is the one that has left the deep or negative imprint about Muslims on the mind of the Christians who used to live under the conditions of the Millet. Devshirme started to be practiced during the time of Sultan Murad I, 1359 to 1389, and this systematic conversion was undertaken by the state. The strongest Christian male children in the age between 8 and 18 years were forcibly conscripted. They were converted to Islam and sent to the capital for special education. Most of these kids were never seen again by their families. In many of the reports made by Western ambassadors and missionaries from the 16th century they described the cruelty carried by the state officers during these family separations. According to the state needs, devshirme was carried out each year or each 3rd or 5th years. Children have always been the most precious and valuable possession of the Balkans people. This is the main reason why most of the positive characteristics of the Millet system have been forgotten and only the terrible memory of devshirme has been preserved amongst the Christians. The example of Bosnians who were converted to Islam shows that for those for whom it was difficult to feed their families they recognized the chance that devshirme offered to their boys. According to a later tradition, Bosnian asked the Sultan for the special privilege of continuing to be subject to the devshirme even after their conversion to Islam. The state gave preference to Muslims in many parts of government and especially in high office. Muslims undoubtedly felt more a part of the state than did the Christians. Maintaining large numbers of non-Muslims resulted in the incorporation of almost the entire Muslim population into the mechanisms of power. Every male Muslim was a soldier, and with some exceptions. None of the non-Muslims had the right to carry a gun. In fact, most of the uprisings of the Christian population on the Balkans have been suppressed in their initial stage by the neighboring Muslims, and the intervention of the government army was very seldom necessary. So, as we can see, the official state toleration did not mean that prejudice disappeared among the Ottoman Muslims and the other millets. Muslims always were the first subjects of the empire, with far greater rights and responsibilities than the non-Muslims. The toleration of the Ottoman state towards its non-Muslim subjects was not by any means Ottoman equality. The Millet system was pragmatic and useful. It worked quite smoothly first 2 centuries of Ottoman rule, but later when the First War failure started, this division of the country into Muslims and non-Muslims led to tension and oppression. Muslims had always better ways to defend their interests. Once the central power lost its control over the periphery of the country, local landlords started to rob their Christian peasants. So for example, the non-Muslims were allowed to live according to their religion as long as their religious practices did not provoke Muslims. But in the periods of political and economic crisis, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries when the decline and disintegration of the empire began, local landlords interpreted in a variety of different ways they wanted the principle not to provoke Muslims. The Christian historical memory has preserved many stories about monasteries, churches and church properties sold by the local authorities. Many of these stories were confirmed by recently discovered Ottoman fiscal documents among the Balkan Christians. Is still alive the memory of the extraordinary levy imposed by the local pashas, the levy of the blunted teeth. Each household visited by the local pasha should provide him and his fellows with food, drinks, accommodation, and should pay the levy of the blunted teeth to the pasha because his teeth were blunted through the hospitality. However, the proscriptions of the Islamic law and Millet rules were one thing, the reality of life sometimes was another. It is difficult to answer the question, if the living conditions of both groups, Muslims and non-Muslims, were that similar, why so many people preferred to adopt Islam instead of remaining Christians. Most of the researchers think that the main reason for conversion was the economic and financial interest. In fact, only those being or becoming Muslim were able to make use of all the possibilities the empire offered. Descent played no role. The decisive factors were to be a Muslim, to be able to speak Turkish, and to be a capable person. Everything said about the advantage of being Muslim is right, but it is not true that one had to be a Muslim in order to become rich in the Ottoman Empire. There were many successful merchants, Greeks, Vlachs, Armenians, who never abandoned Christianity. But it is true that, after the early 16th century at least, it was necessary to be Muslim in order to have a career in the structure of the Ottoman state itself. Tension was existing not only between Muslims and non-Muslims. Soon after the millet system was introduced, tension appeared amongst members of the same millet. For example, in the Orthodox millet, Greeks were in a much better position compared to those of their Slav or Arabs fellows. The reason for it was the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was responsible for the Orthodox millet, which was the biggest in the Ottoman Empire. With no exceptions from the very beginning till the very end, the patriarchs were Greek in origin. Soon after the establishment of the Orthodox patriarchal institution, the patriarchs started to oppress their non-Greek subjects. All the Slav bishops and most of the town priests were replaced by Greek clergy. Slavonic books were burned, and the main aim of the patriarchs was to erase the Slavs' historical memory. So the Ottoman Empire enabled the ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople to fulfill his dream to gain and hold the control of nearly the entire Orthodox world. Such a control even the mightiest Byzantine emperors could not secure for him. The notorious treatment of the Slav Christians by the Greek patriarchs initiated the separation amongst the members of the Orthodox millet. This separation leads in the 19th century to the division of the Orthodox millet into Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian and etc. millets. The same situation can be observed with the Nestorians, who were under the control of the head of the Armenian millet. One should not blame the Sultan for the problems which existing inside the millets. As a true Muslim, the faith was for the Sultan above any ethnic, linguistic, racial, etc. differences. For Islam, the Turkish or Gypsy Muslims have the same dignity as an Arab Muslim. Through the millet system, the Sultan introduced this Muslim pattern to the non-Muslim communities, but for various reasons it did not work. For example, the complete freedom given to the Patriarch of Constantinople in administering church affairs was not always used for the benefits of Christianity. Some patriarchs served the Hellenistic idea more than Christ himself. They turned the words of Jesus that there are no more Jews, Greeks or barbarians, because in Christ everybody is one, into interest everyone should be Greek. We have to admit also that despite the position of the Patriarch was firmly established and his rights over the Orthodox population recognized by the Sultan and the Porte, this position quite often was a terrible one. Often the rights and honor given to him were nothing else but representation of the mercy of the Sultan. The Sultan himself was the source of all rights and mercy, so when he was on the same high cultural level as Mohammed too, the rights of the Patriarch might be observed. When for instance someone like Sultan Selim II was in power, the rights of the patriarch and the millet could be reduced to nothing and there was no one to whom they could complain. The fact is that of 159 patriarchs during nearly 500 years of Ottoman rule, only 21 died a natural death in office. 6 were killed, 27 abdicated, 105 were arbitrarily removed. The sultans could at any moment dismiss patriarch or any of the bishops who incurred their displeasure. Few were able to exercise their pastoral duties for a long period and in peace. The intervention of the civil power into the life of the Orthodox Church was also one of the characteristics of the pre-Islamic period when the emperor exercised this theocracy not always for divine purposes. It is obvious that it is impossible to satisfy the desire for self-rule of every single identity group without causing massive dislocations and violence. That is why the only rational alternative is to look for a model of inter-ethnic and multi-faith coexistence. The Ottomans through the Millet system managed to find a good model of multi-religious coexistence in their polyethnic empire. Under this system, different religious and later ethnic groups enjoyed a wide range of religious and cultural freedoms and considerable administrative, fiscal and legal autonomy. We should not be tempted to compare the rules and canons of the Ottoman Empire with the modern concepts about justice, tolerance and human rights. But the multi-religious model of the Ottoman Empire was much more just and advanced compared to that of medieval Europe even in the 17th century. So Ottoman toleration was not so notable because it was perfect, it was notable because it was far better than what existed elsewhere at that time. Muslims were undoubtedly first-class citizens, but there was enough room for the non-Muslims to practice freely their religions and customs. Later, with the awakening of the economic initiative of the Balkan populations, the restriction of the Islamic law for the non-Muslims became very sensitive. With the Tanzimat reforms started by Sultan Abdulmecid in 1839 and his famous imperial edict of Gulhane, Hat-i-Sharif of Gulhane, the old system of differentiation and distinction and of Muslim legal superiority formally disappeared. Equality of status meant more or less equality of obligation and military service for all. The clothing laws, for distinguishing of Muslims from non-Muslims, disappeared almost entirely and, while the religious courts remained, many of their functions vanished. That brought to existence of new courts, the so-called mixed courts. At first new courts held commercial, criminal, and then civil cases involving persons of different religious communities. Later, beginning in 1869, secular courts, Nizamiye, presided over civil and criminal cases involving Muslim and non-Muslim. Whether or not these changes automatically and always improved the rights and status of individuals Christian, Jew, or Muslim is still debatable and obscure. This new historical reality required changes in the Millet system. During the same 19th century, in 1856 the famous document Hat-i-Humayun was published and became the juridical base for these changes. The time of the good old Millet principle grouping the people on religious ground was over. The process of national awareness had started and it provoked extra tension amongst the members of one Millet, and later it became the main factor for the national liberational movements. Millet system was replaced by the organization of